Cape Cod Broadcasting weaves the listening environments of 99.9 WQRC, Ocean 104.7, WFCC Classical 107.5, Cape Country 104, and CapeCon.com's website experience to reflect the lifestyles of the people who live, work, and play on Cape Cod. We hope that you enjoy this podcast.
This is Sunday Journal. I'm Dan McCready. Virtually anyone who knows anyone who has gone anywhere has gotten a postcard that will tell you all about their travels. These postcards depict images of exotic locales from around the world, such as Paris, Egypt, and even Sandwich. The Sandwich Glass Museum is paying tribute to these cards that depict the famous glass town with an exhibit entitled Wish You Were Here, Postcards from Sandwich. Joining me today to discuss the exhibit is the museum's executive director, Katie Campbell, and she will tell us about the exhibit and the story behind it. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, now just for those who are maybe not familiar, could you just give us a little background on the Sandwich Glass Museum itself?
Sure. The Sandwich Glass Museum is actually was founded under the auspices of the Sandwich Historical Society, which was founded in 1907, and it was basically put together by individuals who are interested in preserving the history of Sandwich. A large part of Sandwich's history was the development of the Sandwich Glass, of Sandwich Glass, which was the Boston and Sandwich Glass Company, which essentially ushered in the industrial age to Cape Cod and into the town of Sandwich. Deming Jarvis, a businessman out of Boston, came down and decided that Sandwich would be the perfect place for him to build his factory. Prior to that, Sandwich had been an agrarian society. Farmers and some sustenance fishing was done, but the locale was ideal for Mr. Jarvis for a number of reasons. Number one, the shallow marshes that surrounded it, its proximity to Boston, the rumored canal building that was going to cut off some of the treacherous waters around the Cape, and the actual marsh grass that was used for packing the glass when it was transported. What was not needed was the sand, which had too much iron in it and consequently made it a green color. So we imported the sand. The other thing that at that time the Cape was famous for timber, and it was the entire Cape was highly wooded. The glass factory pretty much put an end to that, clear-cut the Cape. And roughly 25 years into the factory, we had to import the fuel source as well. So the Glass Museum basically tells the story of Deming Jarvis and the Boston and Sandwich Glass Company, but it also incorporates the history of Sandwich and our contemporary glass blowers that are on the Cape today.
All right. Now we're going to move on to the exhibit. First question, how did the idea for this exhibit all come about?
Well, actually, what it really came about was we got a large collection of postcards bequeathed to us, which got us sort of talking about how cool postcards were. Unbeknownst to us, the MFA in Boston did a very large postcard exhibit last year when they were gifted the Leonard Lauder collection of postcards, and his are international and huge in scope. And we were excited to say, okay, well, because 2014 is the 375th anniversary of Sandwich. Didn't know if you knew that. Mm-hmm. We wanted to do something that sort of celebrated Sandwich. So we looked at our postcards, and we have a lot of them. We have, I think we must have over 4,000 in our collection. Now, not 4,000 are not on exhibit, but there are a lot of postcards on exhibit. And what we did was basically outline the historic Sandwich, the historic downtown, and depict it with the postcards that went along with it. To back up a little bit, the whole postcard craze began the late 1800s. And it started as a really inexpensive way for people to communicate with each other. Mm-hmm. It costs about a penny to buy the postcard and a penny to mail the postcard. It was what I like to say the equivalent of social media. It was the Twitter of its day, if you will. You could buy this postcard. It had an image and an opportunity for you to make a quick message, hi, how are you, see you soon kind of 130 characters or less kind of message and pop it into the mail. And ironically, in some cities, you could mail the postcard in the morning and it would arrive at its destination in the afternoon. It was that quick, which, by today's standards is like the instantaneous joy you get from a Facebook message or a Twitter message.
So now, how many cards are in this exhibit?
Well, that's a good question. Last time I walked through, it looked like it was, I think it's it's probably 300 to 400 cards are on exhibit. And the way the curator has set it up is that we've designated sections of historic Sandwich and the cards that go along with those various sections. So, for example, Town Hall Square, where the Town Hall Sandwich is, had quite a lot of industry at the turn of the century. Consequently, all of those cards are there along with the town hall and the monuments that surround town hall. So you sort of get a sense of place with each section and all the postcards that go along with it.
As we said, a lot of these cards are mostly from the early 20th century, some from the 19th, is that correct? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
So the craze really started the late 1880s and hit its heyday right before and after the First World War. And this was for a number of reasons, but mostly because, like I said, it was an easy way for people to inexpensively communicate with each other. And at the turn of the century, people were particularly interested in travel and celebrating that travel. And one of the ways to do that, like you said in your intro, was that you would send a bragging card, if you will, that I'm here and this is what it's like. And, I'll give you some juicy tidbit and we'll move on. And when I see you, I'll tell you the rest. The equivalent of a slideshow, if you will. So not only did people use them as a sort of a record of where they traveled, but other people started to collect them just so that they had sort of a library of places they could go. And it was a booming, booming business. Many of the postcards were manufactured in Germany. Mm-hmm. So after World War I, that kind of stopped. And so that's why the postcard craze kind of died down. It did pick up again, but it became a little bit more kitschy and less topical, regional or topical. Some postcards were done as photographs physically put on a piece of cardstock and mailed, and some photographers had developed a process where they could actually put the photograph on the paper, and so it was just one piece. And then some had illustrations on them and not photographs at all. And a lot of those were for advertisements and sort of, again, kitschy phrases or cute drawings or voluptuous women or whatever was the craze at that time.
And it sounds like some of these postcards are kind of like family Christmas cards you might get today, where it shows like the family, the kids, because you said some.
They weren't really used because the actual photographic process was fairly laborsome. They weren't really like your family Christmas card, but. As you go through, one of the things that struck me is how the minutia was captured in these postcards, and people bought them. It's 7 different angles of a graveyard. Well, how exciting is it to get a postcard of a graveyard? Well, apparently graveyards were very popular subjects for postcards. Sometimes for witty reasons, like people are sending like happy birthday with a grave on the back. Or they were interested in the genealogy, if it was somebody that they knew or somebody particularly famous. So it was a really it was not so much like a Christmas card, but much more like a testament to where you are, a sense of place.
These depictions of Sandwich that we see in these cards, they show a town that is very, very different in many ways from the Sandwich we know today.
Right. Well, oddly enough, Sandwich sort of morphed from a very pastoral, agrarian town to one, like I said, that became one of the industrial leaders of Massachusetts and New England when the glass industry was at its heyday, which ironically coincided with the postcard popularity. But then, once the glass industry died out, which again was at the late 1880s, it went back to being very historic, and the postcards reflected that again. So the postcards after that sort of celebrate the antiquities of Sandwich, the picturesqueness of Sandwich, and not so much as of the industry. But there was a time there when the cards were very industry oriented, very marketing oriented. This is the tack shop. This is the blacksmith. This is the milliner. That kind of thing. And people bought those postcards and sent them to each other.
Were these cards that you have in the exhibit, were they mailed from Sandwich to elsewhere?
Some of them were. Some of them are not. Some of them are blank,
Okay.
but a lot of them were mailed elsewhere or were mailed from Sandwich to Sandwich. In fact, one of the fun things about the exhibit is the curator has taken a lot of the postcards and flipped them over so you can see the messages and how they correspond to the image that's on the other side. Sometimes they have nothing to do with it, but other times it's very topical based on what the picture is. Like I said, I mentioned the graveyard. There was one card where somebody took the trouble to quote a Blake poem about death comes on something. I've forgotten the quote now. I feel bad because I figured it out. I was so pleased with myself because I figured out the quote. But other times, they talk about their illnesses or their postcards from children to teachers and parents to their children and relatives to friends. And they're all very personal and really compelling, just sort of whisks you back to a different time.
Yeah, because in today's postcards, you don't tend to see that kind of a personal. It's usually like, "Hey, the beach is awesome here. Love Tad," or something.
Exactly. Yeah, that Tad. He's a great guy. That's right. And I think part of the reason is postcards have lost some of their allure, but not only their allure, but postcards have also, there are other ways to communicate. There are so many other, including the telephone, including, Skype, and including, social media, as we discussed before. And so I think there's less content in today's postcards than there was back then. But make no mistake, the way the postcard was designed, you weren't allowed, there wasn't enough room for you to sort of wax poetic about anything. There was only a certain amount of space, and so your message was brief and usually to the point. So I think that the meat of the postcard has changed quite a bit, but essentially the dimensions of the postcard are exactly the same, so it's just how you use it.
But like you were saying, though, in a lot of ways, these weren't so much, like, I think we would only think of a postcard as, like, if I go somewhere, I would send it to you. I would probably, never send a Cape Cod postcard or a Hyannis postcard to somebody who lives in Hyannis. That's just not something people would do today, but like you said, there was a completely different element to them then.
Yes, exactly. But and I wonder if that's actually true, because it's kind of like an in-joke. So if you send a Hyannis card to somebody in Hyannis, especially if it was cutesy or it was an advertisement for a business in Hyannis, you very well might choose that card over something else. And that certainly happened. And like I said, a big part of the postcard's purpose at the time not only was to brag about where you've been, but it was a unique marketing tool and pretty much newfangled. If you remember that most of the magazines and newspapers at that time, all of the images that you saw were illustrations. They were not photographs, because photography was just not that advanced at that time. So these were sort of cutting edge. The cool kids are doing it kind of thing. So, if that was the only postcard you had, and you had a choice between writing a long and cumbersome letter or getting in your horse and buggy and going to visit your friend an hour away, you might choose that Hyannis postcard, knowing that they might get it in the next day and know that you were thinking of them.
And people, like you also said, collected these. These were held on to for a very long time.
Exactly. And in fact, postcard collecting as a general rule is a huge, craze is not the right word, but it is definitely a collectible. And, people don't just collect 2 or 3 of them. They collect thousands and thousands, and usually with some sort of theme in mind. The Lauder collection, for example, that was at the MFA, he collected a huge number of Japanese postcards. So it was all sort of the Japanese culture was reflected, but also the materials and the artistic style. So the sandwich ones are primarily photographs, but there certainly are some that extol the cranberry industry, for example, or the Cape Cod Canal and traveling on the canal and the bridges and the things that you could do on Cape Cod. And again, Sandwich up until the, I think, 1950s or 60s was primarily was not a tourist town. It didn't become a tourist town till after the Second World War. So, they were promoting what they needed to promote to keep viable in and of themselves, not without a tourist industry.
So they had a much more commercial marketing aspect back then than maybe they do now.
Right. And another thing that I found very interesting about the postcard craze was that they were so popular at one point that people had stores that sold only postcards, and including and Sandwich had that. And they were so popular that some people sold them on street corners, like a newspaper. That people wanted them that badly that they would, walk the street and buy a postcard from the guy on the postcard guy on the corner.
And you could make a decent living as being the postcard guy.
So, exactly.
No. If I could just ask, as we're kind of closing out here, in your opinion of the exhibits, what's the most interesting card to you?
The most interesting card. I guess the most interesting card to me is one that is actually of the Sandwich Historical Society, and in one of its first glass shows, and it's a picture of one of the glass shows. And of course, because we're the society, we're interested in that. But the author tells in great detail, within the limited space that she has, how fascinating the Sandwich glass is, and what a cool exhibit it is. And cool, that's my word, not hers. But how interesting it was, and I guess I as being part of that Sandwich Glass Museum culture, find it interesting that people thought it was so interesting when it was relatively new back then. Consider that it was less than 100 years old, not the antique that we consider it now.
So kind of you view it as like a way to you're part of a tradition.
Exactly.
Well, unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I did want to thank you so much for coming in today and discussing this very interesting exhibit with us, so thank you so much.
It's always our pleasure.
My guest today was Katie Campbell, Executive Director of the Sandwich Glass Museum. The exhibit, Wish You Were Here, Postcards from Sandwich, will be in the museum until June 8th. To learn more about the exhibit and the museum itself, visit sandwichglassmuseum.org. I'm Dan McCready, and this is Sunday Journal.
This podcast is a presentation of Cape Cod Broadcasting, which is solely responsible for its content. Thank you for listening. For more information, please visit us at capecodbroadcasting.com.